أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Dear viewers of the MKSI Leicester YouTube channel, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to what will be a series of 10 weeks titled An Exposition of Ashura, which by the time we finish will land us just in time for the beginning of the days of Aba Abdullah and the beginning of the month of Muharram. We are lucky to have been joined. We are lucky to have joined with us Sheikh Anwar Jaffer, the resident alim of the Leicester Jamaat. Sheikh Anwar, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah. How are you, Muhammad?
Alhamdulillah, I'm keeping well. How are you keeping?
Alhamdulillah. Very well.
So, Sheikh, the little bit of a background on what this series entail and what we plan to cover over the next coming weeks.
Yeah, so inshallah, obviously the reason why I decided to choose this subject in particular about Imam Hussein alayhi salam, we learn about his akhlaq, we learn about his theological stance against Yazid ibn Muawiyah, and that's all we do, right? For 10 nights or 11 nights or 12 nights, we go to the center, we listen to Majalis, and we enter the month of Muharram, and then we come out of Ashura, just like how we, for example, enter the month of Ramadan and come out of the month of Ramadan. Time goes very, very quickly. And I thought, why don't we try and examine Ashura from a theological perspective, from an akhlaqi perspective, from a Quranic perspective? Why don't we examine Ashura before entering the month of Muharram, so that when we do enter the month of Muharram, we have a strong understanding of the thawr of Imam Hussein, the uprising of Imam Hussein. I think that would give a very sweet flavor to Ashura, or even the days of Muharram before we even before entering it. So whenever the lecture was to then come to the center, we can then appreciate, the language of, we can appreciate the content of Muharram and the stance of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So inshallah, over the next 10 weeks, we'll discuss some theological perspectives that were believed by, personalities like Umar ibn Sa'ad, ibn Ziyad, personalities like Yazid ibn Muawiyah. The whole issue of, our actions were preordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what Allah wanted for us to do. So we'll discuss that in detail. We'll discuss, for example, the idea of oppression in Islam, the idea of revenge. What does Islam have to say about revenge? Most of us, we have been oppressed by others in the community, or even outside of the community. How do we react to it? That's a very interesting discussion. We talk about this, we'll inshallah talk about the idea or the discussion of how in history, this is considered to be one of the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the practice of Allah, that there's always been a small fraction of people in communities and societies who have turned out to be the creme de la creme, the best of the best. Whereas the majority of the people in society are not necessarily seen to be in favor of the belief in God. So the idea of, the minority having prevalence over the majority. It's a Quranic principle. Inshallah, we'll discuss that in more detail as well. Obviously, then there's the idea of how, from the time of Nabi Adam alayhi salam, you've had the concept of oppression, the battle between haqq and batil that has always existed every generation. Obviously, it's been manifested in different ways. The people, the subjects of oppression, the only difference is that we wear different clothes now, we speak different language, but the essence of it, oppression, is still the same. And then, of course, we'll try to discuss the movement of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Until today, the same questions are being raised. The same questions are now, being pushed forward with the help of YouTube and social media. We'll have people are now more easily able to discuss these questions at length, where they ask fundamental questions as to who killed Imam Hussein alayhi salam. We say that Yazid was the one who killed Imam Hussein, but then they say, look, historically speaking, Yazid didn't kill Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Or, for example, why did Imam Hussein alayhi salam rise? What was his motivation? So all of these are Inshallah, very interesting discussions, and we'll try and expound on this as much as possible in its respective nights.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to the remainder of the sessions. The titles seem quite interesting. So thank you for delving into that. Before we delve in right into the topic, now the title of tonight's discussion is titled The Quranic Significance of the Month of Muharram. And before delving into any of the ayats and before delving into any of the details of the relationship the Quran has with the month of Muharram, what is the importance of today's topic that we're about to discuss?
So today's topic is going to be a prelude to the upcoming topic.
The month of Muharram. So, what would you say, perhaps through the use of examples of the ayat of the Quran, what's the relationship of the month of Muharram within the Holy Quran, and has the month of Muharram been mentioned as part of the Quran?
Right. So, yeah, indeed, it's a very interesting question. In the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the presence of the 12 months. That indeed the number of months with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are 12 months. But then out of these 12 months, in many verses of the Holy Quran, in Surah Tawbah specifically, God speaks about the presence of 4 months in specific. That there are 4 months out of these 12 months that are considered to be Hurum, the months that have sanctity, the months that are spiritual in nature. So there's one particular verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 194, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, شَهْرُ الْحَرَامِ بِالشَّهْرِ الْحَرَامِ بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم شهر الحرام بالشهر الحرام والحرمات قصاص فمن اعتدى عليكم فاعتدوا عليه بمثل ما اعتدى عليكم. It's a very interesting verse. And actually, I'll use this verse as a catalyst for this discussion, tonight's discussion. So the Quran speaks about how there are 4 months out of the 12 months, and these months are considered to be sanctified, considered to be holy months. And this wasn't something that Islam introduced. This is something that was already in existence before the coming of Islam, before even Rasulullah administered his prophethood to the people. The month of Muharram specifically is not mentioned in the Holy Quran. In fact, the only month that is mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, is the month of Ramadan, right? شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. Very famous verse that many of us, inshallah, know. But Muharram in specific, no, it's not mentioned, but its presence is very, very much there. Its presence is there within the ayats of the Holy Quran, and you'll find it in Surah Tawbah specifically. So these 4 months respectively are the month of Rajab, the month of Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, and Muharram. And the reason why these 4 months are isolated and specific is because of the significance it had. And the significance was that during these 4 months, there will be no oppression, there will be no battle, there will be no bloodshed, there will be no fighting between the Arabs living in that time. These were considered to be the months of peace. These were considered to be the months of solidarity, the months where the tribes were able to get together and rectify their differences. If the differences were not rectified, then they would live, or they would learn to live in disagreement, right, without causing any bloodshed. Now I'll come into the details, the specific details in a moment. Let's go back to this verse, Shahrul Harami bi Shahril Haram. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about the sanctity of these 4 months. And he says that within these 4 months, obviously these are sacred months. And these months have to be treated with respect. If anyone was to aggress you in this month, if anyone was to make the first step to fight you in this month, then obviously you have the right to defend yourself. Now, scholars, Mufassirin, the scholars in the fields of tafsir of the Holy Quran, have interpreted this verse in 3 ways. In two of these 3 different interpretations, it's beyond the scope of our discussion tonight. So the first of these interpretations, they approached it from a fiqh perspective, right? الشهر الحرام بالشهر الحرام والحرمات حرمات القصاص, meaning it has a fiqh perspective to it. How should one deal with oppression within these months? And then you had, for example, the economic dimension to it. Again, it's another fiqh discussion. How workers should be treated in this month, and it's something that is discussed amongst the fuqaha and the mujtahideen. What's important is the social dimension, the social interpretation of this month, and this is something that many scholars tend to highlight. The social dimension or the social tafsir of this verse is the historical significance of the month of Muharram, as well as the 3 other months. So they usually delve into, or they tap into the time how the Arabs used to behave before the coming of Islam, specifically looking at the time of Jahiliyyah. And scholars are unanimous in this respect. They say that the time of Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance, was the age of, it was a very unstable period. It wasn't stable. The community, the way the Arabs used to live was very disgusting. It was vile. It was a form, or it was a style which no human being deserves to live, right? And the reason why they used to live in that way was because they were blindly following their forefathers. And that's a vital lesson for us that, times change, generations change. The way we think is completely different to the way our children think. The problems that we face in the communities is completely different to the problems that our children will face. And so by necessity, we need to change the way we raise and not raise them the way we were raised. But when you look at the people of Jahiliyyah, they used to blindly follow their forefathers, stick to their roots. They used to culturally blindly follow them in every area. And that's why they regressed, and they regressed, very, very badly. When you look at, for example, their living standards, there was no stability in the way they used to live. When you look at a community thrives when they develop a strong community where there is water. So whenever there is a source of water, you will naturally find communities being developed in that area. What the Arabs used to do is they would constantly move from one area to another. Whenever they would find a place where there is water, they would establish a community there. Once the water finishes, then they would move to a different place. Again, likewise, a community thrives when there is production, when there is produce, when there are herbs and plants, when the land is fertile. They would abuse the land, and then when the land would, when all the resources are finished, then they would move on to a different land. They would never think about trying to establish a strong community in one particular land, like the way we do, like the way we find today. Likewise, there was no security. Security is a basic right. It's a basic amenity that every single human being deserves. Interesting when you refer to the sermon of Fadak of Fatima al-Zahra, salamullahi alayha, Allahumma salli ala
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
She highlights this. And even in Nahj al-Balagha, when Imam Ali alayhi salam speaks to the people, his community, he highlights this. They make it an effort to try and remind the people, look, this is how you used to live. This is who you were. This is what the Prophet did to you, that he got you out of that situation. He got you out of that quality of life, that standard of life. And he gave you something that you would have never given yourself, not in a million years, right? So in the Sermon of Fadak, she highlights these points. It's very beautiful points. She says, were people who used to live and you used to simply serve others. And you were a tool in their hands. They used to control you. If they had, beef, if they had, for example, a grudge against a different tribe, they used you. They would never fight for themselves, but they used you to fight for themselves. and you wouldn't get anything in return. The people would come and they would take your fires. You look at something like fire, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highlights this in Surah Al-Waqi'ah. He says, look at fire. Are you the one who creates fire, or is it I who creates fire? Fire is basic. It's a basic need, isn't it? Like without fire, you can't do anything in life, really. You can't cook, you can't create, for example, buildings. You can't make bricks. You can't do anything.
It gives life. It gives heat.
Yeah, exactly. It is the source of life. It is the
Yeah.
source of heat. It's a source of sustenance. And then she goes on to say that your rights were trampled by others. And then she says, you know, you drank water from the gutters. People would dispose their filth and you would go and drink that. This was your sustenance. She would say the food that you would eat, you know, people would throw food for the wild animals to come and eat. And this is how you used to sustain yourself. You used to eat this meat. And you were humiliated and you were degraded by the masses. So she makes a very, very beautiful point of how, reminding the people how they used to live. And whatever success they had after the demise of the Holy Prophet, it was sourced from the Prophet himself. And then obviously in Nahj al-Balagha, the Imam alayhi salam explains, you know, you used to live in a state of war and disruption and just used to kill one another. This was the way you used to live. This was your form of entertainment, to go and slaughter tribes. The Quran talks about how, for example, you know, they used to engage in the burying of their children. وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُم مِّنْ إِمْلَاقٍ. People used to fear poverty, and as a solution, rather than, you know, trusting God or trusting their versions of gods, they used to go and they used to bury their infants. Other verses in the Quran imply or strongly implicate that they used to bury their female daughters. Interestingly, you know, scholars ask the question, why? Why did they used to bury their infant daughters? Reason was because there was so much infighting in their communities. There was so much fighting between the tribes that if a person, if a leader of a tribe or someone prominent in a particular tribe had a daughter, they would bury their daughters because they knew that one day, if they were to be overpowered by a different tribe, their women, their children, their daughters would be taken as slaves. And that was a form of humiliation for them. So to deter that, something so probable, you know, you can't guarantee that would happen. Just to deter that probability taking place, they would bury their infant daughters alive. Rasulullah comes and he creates peace, he creates brotherhood. And that's something, you know, phenomenal that the Imam alayhi salam just makes them understand. So the pagans of Arabs, you know, they had no law whatsoever. It was their culture to not have law. It was their culture to just live a life of filth, a life where there is no authority. Interestingly, some historians, they say the best food that they would consider was the food that they would steal from the other tribes. You know, for us today, you know, we enjoy going to restaurants and we enjoy buying meals that we don't often buy because of how expensive it is, and we feel proud that, you know, we fed our families, and the source of this food was, you know, the hard work that I gave back. But no, for them it was more like, you know, let's raid another camp. You know, let's take their daughters and their wives and their wealth and their armor and their weapons. Let's kill their men. Let's take their food, and that food was often celebrated by them. When you look at a lawless system, when you look at, for example, a community that has no governance, no government, that begets dissension. It creates fitna, it creates fasad, it creates senselessness, it creates chaos. You look at what's happening in America, Muhammad, yeah? You got riots everywhere, right? Because of one incident, you've got an entire nation in all 51 states or 50 states who are rising against their authority. Now you've got pure chaos taking place at the moment. What are the people doing? The people realize that there's no law at place. The power of the law has diminished so much so that they are now, you know, rushing into stores and just looting.
Raiding the stores, raiding markets.
Yeah, exactly. You know, you got these video clips online, how people are running into JD Sports and just taking whatever they want, because they realize that they can get away with it. You remove law from a community and it brings about chaos. And this happened in 2010 as well in London, right? We started off in central London and then we saw massive effects of it even in South Africa.
Ripple effect throughout the country.
Exactly. Where the law was literally, it was momentarily paralyzed, but the people just went crazy because they saw it as an opportunity to just, you know,
Hmm.
take opportunity
So,
of it.
so similarly, arguably, the month of Muharram, going back to the kind of topic, the month of Muharram, as you mentioned, was um, a practice that was present in the age of Jahiliyyah, but one that was perhaps honored and honorable. That from the tafsir of the Quran of Surah Baqarah, verse number 194, you mentioned that even though it's a practice that was revered in the days of Jahiliyyah, Allah
Yeah.
subhanahu wa ta'ala continued it post Islam.
Right. So, despite all of these traditions that existed in the month of amongst the people of Jahiliyyah, there were certain good traits that they used to have, right? And hats off for them, hats off to them for having these good traits. And one of them was their, for example, their loyalty to their families and their, their uh, tribes. Obviously, it was to the extreme case where they would show loyalty even if they were wrong, even if their tribes were wrong. And some of these, so the other good traits that they used to have was the month of Muharram, these four sacred
Okay.
months. And that was that during these four sacred months, there would be no fighting whatsoever. That was something that Islam loved. That was something that Islam honored. And Islam made it part of its Sharia, right?
Okay.
When you look at history, historically, every battle that takes place in the time of the Holy Prophet, whether they are significant battles or small battles, none of them took place in the month of Muharram. Rasulullah made sure that the sanctity of the month of Muharram was preserved. Imam Ali alayhi salam, for example, when he engages in fighting with Muawiyah in Siffin and the Khawarij and of course the other uh, demographics in that community, he made sure that during the month of Muharram there would be no fighting whatsoever because of the sanctity of the month, right?
Yeah.
Even if an Arab was to walk into the streets and see the killer of his father or the killer of his brother, if it was the month of Muharram or the other 3 months, he had no right to lift a finger towards him.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Just to remind the viewers that this is a live interactive session, so please do send your questions through the live chat on the YouTube feed. We have received our first question from Maz K. The question states, do you think the law in these cases are just though?
What does it mean?
Maz, are you able to specify in which cases the laws are just? Or Sheikh, would you want to have a go at it, or would you want to wait for a clarification?
I think we need a clarification
Yeah.
on this question.
Okay. So Maz, if you could kindly clarify on which cases these laws may be just. In the meantime, Sheikh, if we can follow on and continue from that. So Muharram was a practice that has come into the realm of Islam through what was practiced in the age of Jahiliyyah. And
Yeah.
now, of course, it has its own significance within the realms of Islam. And because of that, what would you say is our responsibility during the month of Muharram?
Our responsibility in the month of Muharram is to always try and identify what the Ahl al-Bayt used to do in the month of Muharram. How would they treat the month of Muharram, right? How would their interactions change in this month? And when you refer to, for example, the books of du'as like Mafatih al-Jinan, you find that the month of Muharram has its own spiritual significance. And that spiritual significance ideally goes back to Karbala. And when you look at how the Ahl al-Bayt used to behave, their behavior was always in association with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. When Imam Hussein gave his life on the plains of Karbala, by association, the lands of Karbala became holy, right?
Yeah.
So the Imams used to constantly advise and remind their people, have some form of an association with Karbala, have some form of an association with the month of Muharram and with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So when you look at Salah, for example, when you go into sujood, we need to, or it is very, very, very recommended, highly recommended that we perform sujood on the Turba of Karbala, right? That association even should be within our daily lives. And you got so many reports and narrations explaining the fada'il, the merits of just performing sujood on, the Turba of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the Turba of Karbala, because it has certain spiritual significance of it as well. And then you have, for example, the ziyarat. And that's something that we need to do. Inshallah, we'll try and do something in the upcoming months to go into the tafsir of the ziyarat of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, ziyarat al-waritha, ziyarat on the day of Ashura, the ziyarat of, for example, Arba'in, the ziyarah. Imam Hussein has so many different ziyarat, and many of these ziyarats are so similar. It's just re-emphasizing the same principles over and over again. And it's like a very strong method for us to, just remind ourselves of what qualities that we should adopt in our lives. We all want to be Husseinis, right? At the end of the day, we all want to be, or we all crave to be part of the army of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. If Imam Zaman, for example, Ajalallah Ta'ala Farajul Sharif, was to reappear tomorrow, would I stand behind him? Would I be different? Or would I be counterproductive to his mission and his movement? Right? We mentioned these words, Ya laytana kunna ma'ak, fanafuza fawzan azima. We wish we were there with you. Is this lip service to Imam Hussein alayhi salam? If we were there truly standing in the plains of Karbala, where would we stand? And we'll talk about this in the upcoming sessions, inshallah. But it's vital that we recite the ziyarat of Imam Hussein alayhi salam during, Thursday night, during the nights of Muharram as well. It reminds us, it gives us a shock treatment of what qualities I need to develop. Right? So Muharram is not just the month of crying and lamentations and tears. Crying, lamentations, and tears is a prelude of creating change in myself. One of the best ways of creating change is to remember the tragedy of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And we have this in the riwayat. A hardened heart is melted by crying for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. If you can't even cry, then pretend to cry. Very interesting discussion. We'll come to it in the upcoming sessions, inshallah.
Inshallah. And that's a beautiful point. Going back to the month of Muharram, I guess post the Jahiliyyah period, the month of Muharram post Karbala is clearly a call of action for us to kind of come out of the Azadari of Imam Hussein alayhi salam with that fervor in our hearts to kind of make a change in the society and reform the society, and thereby preparing the ground for Imam al-Mahdi ajallahu ta'ala faraja.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned, especially in the tafsir of the verse of the 194th verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, on how even the Jahiliyyah or the people during the age of Jahiliyyah would give such a regard to the months of Rajab, Zil-Qa'dah, Dhul-Hijjah, and of course Muharram. And they wouldn't even fight so much. So if they would see the killer of their father, they would still kind of wait for the other months to come. Now, arguably, the Battle of Karbala is clearly one of the battles that is very significant, not just for us Shias, but in the wider context of the religion of Islam. And given that this is a particularly sacred month, even for those before that came before Yazid, so now arguably, some may say that what's the reason that this Battle of Karbala had to be fought in the month of Muharram? Of course, there are two sides of the story. Of course, there's that of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and there's that of Yazid, la'natullah alayh. Are you able to shed some light on the necessity criteria that led Imam Hussein alayhi salam to fight in such a sacred and respected month?
Right. So when you look at, for example, just having spoken of the sanctity of the month of Muharram, you can appreciate the crimes of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. So Yazid ibn Muawiyah wasn't someone who just slaughtered Imam Hussein alayhi salam. He violated the sanctity of the month. You look at, for example, Ibn Muljam, la'natullah alayhi, right? Ibn Muljam, again, he's not just someone who killed Imam Ali alayhi salam. That's not the crime that he was guilty of. Yes, it's a significant crime. There's no doubt in that. But there are other crimes that he committed simultaneously. And number one, it was striking the Imam on the head. Number two, it was violating the sanctity of Masjid al-Kufa. right? We have narrations saying that, if you pray 2 rak'ah in Masjid al-Kufa, it's multiplied by so many folds. Number three, it was during the month of Ramadan. Not only that, it was during Laylatul Qadr. So he was, the sins that he committed in that single act was compounded one after another. There's like different layers of sins. It's the same principle with Yazid. Yazid, he violated the month of Muharram. The month of Muharram was made sanctified by God, number one. Number two, he then went and he provoked the battle and he slaughtered Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Not only that, but even beyond that, in the following years, he goes and he engages in an onslaught in the city of Mecca. He destroys the Kaaba, the men, the women, the children, they're all violated. Their rights and their sanctity is violated. He goes to the city of Medina. The city of Medina, he damages the masjid of the Holy Prophet, um, to the extent that they say that there was, a man, Walid ibn Abdul Malik. He massacred so many people and slaughtered so many people in the month of in the city of Medina that the blood flowed even on top of the grave of the Holy Prophet. The Kaaba, if you just look at the sanctity of the Kaaba, they say that if a criminal, the worst of criminals, to enter the sanctity of Masjid al-Haram, no one has the right to forcefully remove him. No one has that right, because that is a form of um, violence, right? They have to wait that this criminal becomes hungry and thirsty and eventually needs to leave Masjid al-Haram. Only then can they capture him. But Yazid, he just walks into the Kaaba and he starts slaughtering people. So his crimes were, compounded one level after another. Now, obviously, you have those who support the actions of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. That's a different discussion. Very interesting discussion. Why did they support Yazid ibn Muawiyah? The reason is because he was Hakim al-Sham. He was the leader of the time. A Muslim does not have the right to go against the leader of his time, whether he's a good person or a bad person, regardless. What Imam Hussein alayhi salam was wrong. What he did was not in line with the Sharia. So this is the opinions that they have. And not even that, but they go on even further and say that Imam Hussein was fully to blame. And the reason is because he was the one who led an uprising against Yazid in the month of Muharram. So technically Imam Hussein is at fault. But when you read the historical um, events of what happened in Muharram and what happened on the day of Ashura, um, you see that the burden falls on the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad, the burden falls on the shoulders of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. So I'll give you a number of different examples. On the 9th of Muharram, for example, Imam Hussein alayhi salam asks for an extra day. Why would he ask for an extra day if he is adamant in fighting and just leading an uprising against Yazid? Why is he postponing his time? Why is he trying to buy more time? That's the first thing. Secondly, you find, for example, the blocking of the water, right? The army took extra steps to try and weaken the army of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the companions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So these are like evidences to show that the Imam wasn't the one engaging in the battle, wasn't the one who took the first step in fighting against the army. It was they who took the initiative to try and fight against Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Like on the day of Ashura, the shooting of the arrow. Who was the first one to shoot the arrow? It was Umar ibn Sa'ad. It was he who began the battle. And then he turns to his companions and he says, be a witness to Ibn Ziyad that I was the one who initiated the battle. Again, going back to the verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 194, the ayah says, right, okay, we've made these months sanctified. We've sanctified these months. We've made it sanctity. We've given it some form of holiness. But if, on the other hand, you are attacked in this month, then you have every right to defend yourself, right? You can't turn around and say, okay, I'm being attacked in the month of Muharram. The month of Muharram is a sanctified month. I can't fight because it's a month of peace. And in turn, you are putting yourself in danger. Islam says no. Now, your life is worth far greater than the sanctity of the month of Muharram. You are in the stance of, if you're in a defensive stance, right? So that's exactly what Imam Hussein alayhi salam does. He defends himself. The entire battle of Ashura was a defensive strategy from Imam Hussein alayhi salam's perspective.
And then I guess the point of Yazid's sins compounding on themselves is even before he attacked the Holy Kaaba, Imam Hussein alayhi salam tried to find refuge within the sanctity of the Holy Kaaba, even during the month of Dhul Hijjah, but had to transform his Hajj to Umrah because of fearing that the sanctity of the Holy Kaaba will be violated. So, yeah,
his famous words where he says, even if I was to hide in the belly of an animal, they would,
cut it open.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Awesome. We have another question from Maz. I believe it's Mazahir. It says, can you also shed some light that the 1st of Muharram is a month of grief for us, but for other sects, it's classed as the Islamic New Year and treated as a celebration?
Yeah, so we have narrations, right? These narrations can be found in Sahih al-Bukhari and the books of our brothers, may Allah bless them, where the month of Muharram or the day of Ashura in specific was a day when, for example, I can't remember on top of my head, but it was the day when the flooding stopped for Nabi Noor, the day when, for example, if I'm not mistaken, Nabi Yunus he came out of the belly of the whale, if I'm not mistaken. But certain events happened in the time of the Prophet's lives, which, was interpreted as a celebration. So, and then you have, for example, the idea of fasting on the day of Ashura, which is a celebrative concept in itself. So it's a tradition that kind of was preserved in the eyes of the Ahl Sunnah, that the 10th of Muharram is, of course, a day of celebration rather than a day of commemoration. But obviously, when you refer to the Ahl al-Bayt and the teachings of the Ahl al-Bayt, which is a source of our religion and our madhab, they make it specifically clear that the month of Muharram is a month of lamentation. Change, spiritual change, is channeled through crying and shedding tears for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Yeah.
Hassan, thank you for the question, Mazahir, and thank you, Sheikh, for elaborating on that. I believe we're nearing the end of our time. Before providing any concluding remarks, Sheikh, would you like to shed some light on potentially what the next week's topic may be, or is that something that you'd like to leave us in suspense?
Yeah, let's leave it for the suspense.
Let's leave this as suspense so the viewers can have an eager week looking for what the aspects of next week's discussion would be.
Inshallah.
So those of you that haven't yet had a chance to ask a question, feel free to email alim@mksileicester.org any questions that may relate to this topic or otherwise. Otherwise, please do definitely join in next week, and hopefully you can answer all your questions relating to the topic there. Sheikh, before we kind of end it here, is there any final concluding remarks that you would like the viewers to leave with?
Yeah, inshallah. Tonight is, of course, Friday night. We've got literally a half an hour before the time of Maghrib. Let's try and take as much benefit of the Friday night, or the last hour, or the last minutes of Friday. Try and give sadaqah, inshallah. There are many people out there who are suffering financially. Let's try and give them something from our pockets, ease their affairs, inshallah. Yeah. It's the best thing that we can do on the Friday, inshallah. May Allah accept our amal.
Ameen. Thank you. Well, Jazakallah. Today was the first of the series title and exposition of Ashura. As a way of summary, we were able to discuss the significance, the Quranic significance of the month of Muharram, where you eloquently mentioned how Rajab, Zil-Qa'dah, Zil-Hijjah, and the month of Muharram were sacred even before even during the times of Jahiliyyah, and how Yazid violated its sanctity. It's one that we have a responsibility towards, that when we come out of crying out of the Azadar of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, it should create a fervor within our hearts, so that we use the month as a call for action, as a call that we can do something to reform our society, just how Imam Hussein alayhi salam had intended to do so. So thank you so much, Sheikh, for your time, and we eagerly look for next week's discussion with the series title and exposition of Ashura. To all the viewers, thank you so much for joining in. And finally, we raise our hands and pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept whatever little that we had to offer in His service. And finally, for all those that are affected with the pandemic, emotionally, mentally, financially, or physically, or otherwise, to alleviate everyone's troubles, inshallah, quickly. And finally, for our 12th successor of the Holy Prophet, Imam al-Hujjah, Ajjallahu ta'ala faraja, his reappearance to be hastened, and when he does so, that we are also part of his ashab and his ansar. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah, Sheikh.
Ahsan, jazakumullah.